he sent a final radio message. After he was confirmed dead. The message was real. The soldier wasn't. What really happened inside that bunker? What if the dead could speak? What if, in their final moments, they reached out from beyond the grave, leaving us a message we could never ignore? It was a late autumn evening, the kind where the air hangs heavy with a chill that settles in your bones, and the dark comes too quickly. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the only sound was the rustling of dry leaves beneath the feet of those still working outside. But then, a strange crackle filled the night, an eerie, haunting whisper that sent a chill down the spines of those who heard it. "He's dead," they said. "He's been dead for hours. We saw it with our own eyes. But the message came through." The crew had long believed they were alone, stranded on the outskirts of an isolated military installation, a place where strange occurrences were just a matter of routine. They were working on an old communications relay tower, a relic from decades past, one that had been untouched for years. It was meant to be a simple assignment: patch the system and get out. But as the signal began to hum to life, none of them could have predicted the chilling events that followed. Their radios crackled with static, and then, without warning, a voice. But not just any voice. This one sounded too clear, too deliberate, as if it had traveled through time itself. The voice on the other end wasn't just a random transmission. It was one that should have never been heard again, not after the body was confirmed dead, not after the team had already marked it as a tragedy. Yet here it was. "Help me." That was all it said. The voice came from someone they had already buried, someone they had already mourned, a man who had been pronounced dead in the same room where they had listened to his last breath, a man who, against all logic, was now calling for help. Their minds raced, struggling to grasp the impossible. No one knew what to do, and even fewer had the courage to speak the words that were hanging in the air. What if the dead could speak? The voice crackled one more time before the radio went silent. But even in that silence, there was an undeniable presence, a lingering sensation that something had just crossed the boundary between life and death. What was this? A strange glitch? A freak accident? Or something else? Something far more sinister? The team's initial shock faded quickly, replaced by a mixture of fear and disbelief. Some of them suggested it was a prank, a cruel joke to keep their minds occupied in the dead of night. Others said it could be a mistake, a glitch in the old system. But deep down, they all knew the truth. They weren't alone out there. Something was watching them. As the night dragged on, the strange whispering only grew louder, more insistent. Each time, it called, out, faintly, as if the speaker were struggling to stay connected. Each time it sent waves of panic rippling through the crew. This wasn't a message from the living. This was something else. Something from the other side. They couldn't explain it, and truth be told, they didn't want to. But one thing was certain. This was no ordinary radio malfunction. It was a message that would shatter everything they thought they knew about the world, and the thin veil between the living and the dead. As the hours ticked by, the question on everyone's mind became impossible to avoid. What would you do? The following morning, the team gathered in the small, dimly lit operations room, trying to piece together what had happened the night before. The radio, now silent, sat in the corner of the room, untouched. The crackling voice had come through so clearly, so undeniably, that no one could forget it. But the questions it raised were far more unsettling than anything they could have anticipated. "I don't care what anyone says," Sergeant Danvers, the team leader, said, his voice low, almost shaking. That wasn't a mistake. It wasn't static or interference. It was too deliberate. The others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, eyes shifting nervously from one to the other. The air in the room felt thick, as if the very walls were closing in. It wasn't just that they had heard the voice. It was that it had come from someone they knew, someone who had already been marked as deceased. "That's the problem," replied Dr. Kessler, the team's radio specialist. "We confirmed it. The man's dead. He was dead long before we even set up this tower." She wasn't wrong. The body had been examined, declared dead by multiple medical experts, and transported back to headquarters for further investigation. There had been no signs of life, no signs of movement. They had seen it with their own eyes. So how could this have happened? The radio log from last night was still open, its last entry blinking on the screen. "Help me." The words had been spoken clearly, but the circumstances behind them remained as murky as ever. Dr. Kessler had tried to explain it as some kind of technical malfunction, a random glitch in the tower's ancient equipment. But even she didn't sound convinced. The more she replayed the transmission, the more she began to feel that the sound was too human, too real. At the same time, Corporal Harris, the youngest member of the team, had started to feel something was off long before the voice appeared. He had noticed strange lights the night before, flickering in the distance, beyond the perimeter of the station. They were so faint at first, barely visible. But as the hours stretched on, the lights grew brighter, moving in unnatural patterns across the darkened landscape. No one had mentioned the lights at first. Harris had kept it to himself, not wanting to seem paranoid. But now, as he watched the others exchange anxious glances, he felt the need to speak up. "I saw them," Harris said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. "The lights, they weren't just flashlights or anything like that. They were too controlled, like someone was moving them on purpose." "Controlled?" Danvers echoed, his voice rising in disbelief. "What are you talking about, Harris? This place is dead. No one's out there." Harris shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "I know what I saw. They were too far to be anything normal. And I'm not the only one who saw them." Dr. Kessler raised an eyebrow. "You're not the only one." "Yeah," Harris continued, shifting nervously. "Lorna saw them too, right before the radio crackled to life." Lorna, the team's communications officer, nodded slowly. "I saw something, but I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks. We've been here too long, and everything starts to blend together." She paused, glancing around at the others. "But now that I think about it, it wasn't like anything I've ever seen before. It didn't look like someone was out there. It felt like something was watching us." A heavy silence filled the room. No one spoke. No one moved. The weight of the unspoken thoughts hung in the air. This was no longer just a case of malfunctioning equipment. The things they were witnessing, the things they were hearing. It wasn't natural. Danvers stood abruptly, pacing the small space. "Fine. We'll go check it out. We'll look for these lights, these controlled lights, Harris. But if this is some kind of prank, I'll make sure the whole base knows." But even as the words left his mouth, a part of him, perhaps the deepest part of him, didn't believe it. He was searching for answers, but a more troubling question lingered in his mind. What if there was no explanation? Later that day, they gathered at the base of the communications tower, the spot where the strange occurrences seemed to converge. They were met with the eerie stillness of the surrounding landscape. Nothing stirred in the wind. The only sound was the hum of the radio tower, a steady, almost comforting noise. For a while, they searched the area surrounding the tower, eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. But everything appeared normal. Too normal. In fact, it was as if the very landscape had been frozen in time, locked in place by something unseen, yet undeniably present. Danvers was about to call the search off when Lorna, who had wandered slightly ahead, suddenly froze in place. Her eyes were wide, her face pale as she turned to the group, her voice barely a whisper. "Look." They followed her gaze, and their eyes fell upon a small, metallic object half buried in the dirt. At first it seemed like nothing, just another piece of debris in the desolate landscape. But as they approached, they realized it was far more than that. It was a broken radio transmitter, a small handheld device. It was old, its casing cracked, and the antenna was bent at an odd angle. But the most peculiar part was that the device was still on. The dial was lit, faintly flickering as if it had just been turned on. Danvers reached down and picked it up carefully. His fingers brushed against something cold, almost unnaturally so. He felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. "Where did this come from?" he asked, his voice quiet but urgent. No one had an answer. No one could explain why it was there or how it had gotten there. But they all knew one thing. This wasn't a coincidence. The past few hours had been filled with strange occurrences, but this felt different. The broken transmitter, the lights in the distance, and the chilling message, they all seemed connected. And somewhere in the back of their minds, a deeper fear was starting to take shape. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. And the worst part? They were only beginning to uncover the truth. The tension in the room was palpable, each member of the team weighed down by an unspoken dread, as if they were all slowly coming to the realization that whatever was unfolding here was beyond anything they had ever prepared for. No one knew how to approach it. This strange anomaly, this impossible message from a dead man, the mysterious transmitter in the dirt. But amid the confusion and uncertainty, there was one thing they all agreed upon. They needed to talk to someone who had witnessed it firsthand, someone who had experienced the full terror of the night. Enter Sergeant Michael Jacobs, a man with a reputation as solid as the rock he was known to climb. A man who had seen more than his fair share of military operations, who had stared down danger and lived to tell the tale. But this was different. This wasn't an operation. This wasn't an enemy you could fight. This was something else entirely. Jacobs had been the one to send the last communication before the night fell silent. He had been the one who, in a desperate attempt to make sense of it all, had tried to reassure his team, to assure them that this was just some bizarre fluke. The voice, he had said, had to be a mistake. But deep down, even he had started questioning that conclusion. It had all started innocently enough. Jacobs had been stationed near the base of the communications tower with a small crew. They had set up camp for the night, and as usual, there had been the typical distractions, the hum of equipment, the crackle of radios, the usual banter between soldiers trying to pass the time. But then, something had changed. "I heard it," Jacobs said slowly, as the team gathered in the operations room to hear his story. His voice was tight, almost hesitant. It wasn't like any radio transmission I'd ever heard. There was something in it, a kind of desperation, a kind of pleading. The others listened intently. Jacobs didn't often show vulnerability, but there was something about this experience that had stripped him of his usual bravado. "I swear," he continued, rubbing his eyes as if trying to shake off a memory. "It came through clear as day, and I tried to respond, but no matter what I did, the transmission just kept repeating. Help me." Over and over, like it was trapped in some kind of endless loop. He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I tried everything, checked the equipment, reran the diagnostics. Nothing. The signal was coming through like clockwork, too perfect to be a glitch. So I thought maybe I'd misheard it. Maybe I was just tired. But it was real. It was realer than anything I've ever felt before. The room was silent as Jacob's words hung in the air. No one dared to speak, unsure how to even begin processing what he had just said. A cold shiver seemed to pass over them all. The strangest part was the silence that followed, Jacob said, his voice growing softer. After that last transmission, everything went dead. The air, it felt wrong, like the whole place was holding its breath. I thought I was losing it, and then I went to check the radio again. That's when I saw it. He looked up at the others, his gaze locked onto each of them, as if daring anyone to suggest it had been a hallucination. The radio equipment. It wasn't just turned off, it was broken, like someone had yanked the wires out of it. But nothing was disturbed. No one was there. The team exchanged uneasy glances, the words not quite sinking in. How could this be? How could they explain something so completely beyond reason? Jacobs hadn't been the only one to feel it. Each of them, in their own way, had sensed that something was terribly wrong. The dead man's voice had cut through the night, and now it felt like something else was starting to stir. Jacobs shook his head, visibly frustrated. I didn't want to believe it. I thought we were just hearing things. But after everything that happened, I know what I heard, I know what I felt. It was real, and I'm telling you, whatever's going on here is not something we can just walk away from. The room was eerily still after Jacobs finished speaking, and it felt as though the weight of his words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating any remaining sense of normalcy. The team had known danger before. They had braved storms, hostile territories, and enemy forces. But they had never encountered this, not something they couldn't explain, something that defied reason and logic. Dr. Kessler was the first to speak, breaking the silence. We need more data. This can't just be dismissed as coincidence. We need to go over every piece of equipment, every inch of this place. We need to know exactly what's going on here. Danvers nodded, but his mind wasn't entirely on the task at hand. Something about Jacob's account had shaken him to his core, and now, with every passing minute, he felt as though he were descending further into a nightmare with no way out. We'll search the entire area, Danvers said, standing up, his voice commanding. We need answers, and we need them fast. We're not leaving until we figure this out. But as they prepared to search the facility once again, Jacobs couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The voice, the mysterious lights, the broken transmitter, it was all connected. And yet, the more he thought about it, the less he understood what they were up against. He felt the weight of an ancient, unseen presence watching them, waiting for the moment when the veil between the living and the dead would finally tear. As Jacob stepped toward the door, he turned back to the group, his face pale. Whatever happens, don't trust your eyes. Don't trust what you hear, because it's not real. None of it is real. The door clicked shut behind him, and the team was left alone in the oppressive silence. No one said a word. No one moved. But they all knew one thing for sure. What they had just heard, what they had just seen, was only the beginning. The search for answers had become a frantic endeavor, but with each passing hour, the mystery seemed to grow deeper, more complex, and undeniably sinister. Every step they took toward the truth led them to more questions, and every piece of equipment they checked, every corner of the facility they explored, only revealed more signs of disturbance. The situation was no longer something that could be written off as a series of strange coincidences or technical glitches. This was something far beyond their comprehension, something that was actively reaching out from beyond the grave. It began with the equipment. At first, it was the broken radio transmission, a ghostly voice crackling through the airwaves. But then there were the lights, strange, flickering beacons in the distance that seemed to move on their own, just outside the range of their vision. The team had already discussed it, and some had dismissed it as nothing more than a product of tired eyes or imagination. But there was no denying it now. The lights had returned, and this time they were accompanied by something far more unsettling, a sudden, inexplicable cold that filled the air like a heavy mist. The cold wasn't like any chill the team had ever felt. It wasn't the sharp, biting cold of the night air. It wasn't even the cold that might come with an old, malfunctioning generator. No, this was something else entirely. A suffocating, unnatural cold that seemed to seep into their bones, making their teeth chatter and their breath freeze in the air, even though the outside temperature hadn't changed a degree. Corporal Harris was the first to notice it. He had been scanning the horizon, trying to pick out the flickering lights when he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Something had shifted in the air, something subtle, yet undeniable. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, but the cold refused to leave. It was as though it was following him, clinging to him like a shadow. "Do you feel that?" he asked, his voice cracking. Lorna, who had been standing beside him, nodded slowly, a look of unease crossing her face. "Yeah, it's like the temperature dropped all of a sudden. I thought it was just me." But it wasn't just them. Danvers had felt it too, and Jacobs had been the first to openly acknowledge it. "This is no coincidence," Jacobs muttered under his breath, eyes scanning the area nervously. "It's like something's out there." There was no way to describe it properly, this feeling that settled in their chests like a weight, suffocating and ominous. And then came the noises. It started as little more than a faint hum, barely perceptible, as if the air itself was vibrating. At first, the sound was barely noticeable, lost beneath the low murmurs of the team as they continued their search. But then it grew louder, filling the space around them with a soft, eerie whine. It didn't sound like anything mechanical. It wasn't the hum of a motor or the buzz of electrical equipment. No, this was different. This was organic, like the sound of something trying to make itself heard, but unable to fully break through. Lorna was the first to suggest they investigate the noise further, but the suggestion was met with hesitation. No one wanted to admit it, but they all felt it. The fear gnawing at the edges of their resolve, the creeping sense that they were no longer in control of the situation. Despite their reservations, they made their way toward the source of the hum, the sound growing louder and more oppressive with every step. The closer they got, the colder it seemed to become, as if the very earth beneath them had turned to ice. At the edge of the facility, behind a rusted gate that had once been locked, they found something truly disturbing, a radio antenna. It was bent at an odd angle, and it looked old, very old. But what was even more unsettling than the strange device itself was what they found at its base. A series of chalk markings drawn hastily across the ground. They were not random, not at all. The patterns were deliberate, intricate, and undeniably strange. Some of the markings were circular, others triangular, and some had symbols that none of them could recognize. They were all connected by thin lines, forming a network of sorts. But the most disturbing part? The center of the pattern was marked by an old, decayed military dog tag. Jacobs knelt beside it, his breath visible in the frigid air as he picked up the dog tag with trembling fingers. His eyes widened as he read the name etched into the metal. "Private Jameson," he murmured, his voice barely audible. That's the guy from the transmission, the one who's dead." The others stood frozen in place, unable to speak as Jacobs turned the tag over in his hand. He ran his fingers over the metal, his face pale as he whispered, He's the one who spoke to us. This is his dog tag. How is this possible? The realization hit them all at once. Private Jameson, the man they had confirmed dead, had somehow left a trace behind. Something that was far more than just a memory. This was a presence, a lingering force that refused to be erased, even in death. The team had been trying to piece together a puzzle, but now it seemed as if the puzzle had been staring them in the face all along. The air around them seemed to thicken, and a strange sense of vertigo swept over them. The sounds from the radio tower, the coldness, the lights in the distance. It was all beginning to connect in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The dog tag was the final clue, the confirmation of something that none of them were ready to face. Jameson wasn't gone. Not completely. And then, as if to drive the point home, the radio crackled to life once again. This time, however, there was no message, no voice crying out for help, only a sharp, discordant screech of static. It was deafening, and for a brief moment, everyone froze, as though the sound was too powerful to ignore. The team scrambled to find the source of the noise, frantically switching between channels on the radio, but it was useless. The screeching continued, louder and more unbearable with each passing second. Then, in the midst of the chaos, it happened. A single, clear voice cut through the static. "It's not over." The transmission ended as abruptly as it had begun, and the room fell silent. None of them knew what to do next. But one thing was clear. They had only just scratched the surface of a much darker mystery, and this wasn't something they were going to walk away from unscathed. The room was heavy with silence as the team processed the chilling transmission. "It's not over." The words echoed in their minds, reverberating off the walls of their consciousness like a pulse that refused to fade. The static had subsided, but its lingering presence seemed to cling to the air around them, a reminder of the unsolved mystery that was tightening its grip on them all. Sergeant Danvers was the first to break the silence, his voice steady but weighed down by the enormity of what they had just experienced. "We need to find out who Jameson really was," he said, his tone decisive. "There's got to be something in his history that explains this, something that links him to what's happening here." Jacobs nodded, his fingers still tight around the cold dog tag. "We've got to dig deeper. This isn't just about a missing soldier or a tragic death. There's more at play here." The team agreed. If they were ever going to make sense of what was happening, they needed to understand the man whose voice had crossed the veil of death. They needed to trace the steps of Private Jameson, not just the soldier they thought they knew, but the man whose past might hold the key to unlocking the horrors they were facing. The records were scattered and incomplete. The military files were old, almost forgotten, buried in the recesses of a long-abandoned archive. Yet, as the team sifted through the files, piecing together bits and pieces of Jameson's life, they began to uncover something disturbing. Something that suggested his death wasn't as simple as they had been told. Jameson had been part of a covert military operation years earlier, an operation that had been sealed off and classified, hidden away from public knowledge. The details were vague, filled with official redactions and blacked-out lines. But one thing stood out. The mission had taken place in a remote area, an isolated stretch of land not far from the communications tower they were stationed at now. And it wasn't just any mission. It was a mission that had involved top-secret research into the paranormal, research that had been kept from the public eye. Lorna leaned over Jacob's shoulder as he flipped through the documents, her eyes scanning the pages, her expression growing darker with every line she read. This isn't just a military operation. This is something else. It says here that they were investigating something in the area, something that the team believed was supernatural. Danvers joined them, his brows furrowed. A supernatural operation? What the hell were they thinking, sending soldiers into something like that? The answer, as they would soon find out, was far more unsettling than they could have imagined. As the team dug deeper into the files, they uncovered reports of strange occurrences, lights in the sky, unexplained disappearances, and communications from other military units that described encounters with entities that defied explanation. The files were filled with strange symbols, coded language, and references to events that seemed disconnected from anything the military would consider a normal operation. But the most shocking revelation was the mission's final report, one that had been signed by Jameson himself. It described a discovery deep in the heart of the wilderness, a phenomenon unlike anything the team had ever encountered. They had found something there, something ancient, something that shouldn't have existed. The report was cryptic, but the implications were undeniable. Jameson and his team had encountered an entity, an intelligence that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of time and space, something that was older than humanity itself. The report ended abruptly, its final lines hidden under blacked-out text. But it was clear that whatever Jameson had encountered, whatever his team had uncovered, had never truly been left behind. It had followed them, and now it had found its way to them. Jacobs felt his stomach twist as he read the last entry. The words jumped out at him, their meaning clear despite the censoring. The entity is not bound by death. It is an echo of the past, and it seeks to return. Danvers stood up, his face pale as the realization dawned on him. This is what we're dealing with. Whatever it was they found, it didn't just stay there. It's been following them, and now it's following us. The implications were impossible to ignore. The supernatural occurrences, the cold, the lights, the radio transmissions, everything pointed to one chilling fact. The entity that had haunted Jameson and his team had never been contained. It had lingered, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And now, Jacobs murmured, we've become part of it. Whatever Jameson and his team unleashed, we've stepped into it. Lorna, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. But why? Why come after us? What does it want from us? Danvers exhaled slowly, his mind racing. That's the million-dollar question, Lorna, and we're running out of time to figure it out. They couldn't ignore the truth anymore. They weren't just dealing with a man who had died and left a message. They were dealing with something much darker, something that had a history tied to the very land they were standing on. And whatever it was only growing stronger. They needed to act quickly. They needed to figure out how to stop it before it was too late. Jacobs placed the dog tag down gently on the table, his eyes cold with determination. We're not just here to fix a radio tower anymore. We're here to end this. The heavy air around them seemed to thicken with every passing hour, each of them now acutely aware that they were no longer dealing with something ordinary. The entity they had uncovered, the one Jameson and his team had encountered, had already begun to make itself known in ways that were far too real to ignore. The strange lights continued to flicker in the distance, but now they seemed closer, more purposeful, almost as if they were tracking the team's every movement. The cold, unrelenting chill that hung in the air grew stronger, seeping into their clothes, their bones, until it felt as though nothing could escape its grip. Yet it wasn't the lights or the cold that filled the team with the most dread. No, it was what they saw next, what they felt, and what they couldn't explain. It happened in the dead of night, hours after the unsettling discovery of Jameson's mission files. The team had settled in for what little sleep they could manage, but rest was a distant memory. There was no comfort in the cold, and the shadows outside their camp seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if they were alive, moving just beyond the reach of their vision. Corporal Harris had been the first to notice something was off. He'd been lying awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling when he felt it. A cold draft against his face, as if the air itself had shifted. He turned, his heart pounding, and caught the faintest flicker of movement at the edge of the camp. It was just a shadow, too faint to be anything solid, too fast to be natural. He sat up, heart racing, and rubbed his eyes. "What the hell?" he whispered to himself. At first he thought it was nothing, his mind playing tricks on him in the dark. But the shadow had moved again, this time closer. It was like something was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. Suddenly, a sound broke the quiet of the night. An eerie, distant whisper, almost like a voice. Harris froze, his eyes wide. The whisper was too soft to make out, but it was unmistakable. It was calling out to him. With trembling hands, Harris grabbed his flashlight and stood up, cautiously walking toward the edge of the camp. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the quiet stillness of the night. Then the whisper came again, louder this time, as though it was right behind him. "Help me!" Harris spun around, his flashlight trembling in his hand. But there was no one there. He glanced over to the others, but none of them had stirred. The camp was silent, almost too silent, the kind of silence that felt oppressive, like it was hiding something. But Harris wasn't the only one who had heard it. Lorna, who had been trying to sleep in a nearby tent, suddenly sat up, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had heard it too, loud and clear, that voice. She rushed out of her tent, her flashlight sweeping the camp as she looked for Harris. When she found him, standing alone, his face pale and his hands shaking, she didn't need to ask what had happened. "I heard it too," Lorna whispered, her voice barely audible in the dark. Harris nodded, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "It was behind me. I swear it was right behind me." But there was nothing. Nothing but the heavy silence that clung to the camp like a fog, thick and suffocating. As Lorna turned to look around, the beam of her flashlight caught something in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat. The faint glow of the lights, those same flickering lights that had been haunting them for days, appeared once more, moving erratically across the horizon. But these lights weren't just far off. They were getting closer. Without a word, Lorna grabbed Harris's arm. "We need to get the others," she urged, her voice tight with fear. "Now!" The two of them rushed back to the main area where the rest of the team had set up camp. Jacobs and Danvers were already awake, their faces grim. Jacobs' eyes were wild, a sense of panic creeping into his usually composed demeanor. "Did you hear it?" Harris asked, his voice urgent. "The voice. It's not just the voice," Jacobs interrupted, his voice tense. "I've seen something, out there, something moving." The entire camp fell into uneasy silence as they all tried to make sense of what was happening. They had all felt it, the presence that lurked just outside their view, the sensation of being watched, of being hunted. But then came the next chilling turn. The radio crackled again, loud and sudden, cutting through the quiet like a knife. The familiar static filled the air, and then, unmistakably, the same voice they had heard before, Private Jameson, returned. "It's coming for you," the voice said, each word dragged out slowly, as if it were struggling to speak from the other side. The transmission ended abruptly, and once again, silence took over. But this time it wasn't just an eerie quiet. It was a suffocating, oppressive stillness that seemed to press in on them from every direction. "What the hell does that mean?" Danvers muttered, rubbing his temples. His usual bravado was gone, replaced with a palpable sense of dread. "We need to get out of here, now." But before anyone could respond, the lights that had been flickering in the distance flared brightly, illuminating the entire area for a split second. The blinding light was so intense that it seemed to sear into their retinas, and for a moment all they could do was shield their eyes, helpless. When the lights finally faded, everything went dark. Utterly dark. Even the stars above had vanished, consumed by a darkness so deep it felt unnatural. And then came the final blow. A figure, faint and distorted, stood at the edge of the camp, its form shifting in the darkness, its presence both unsettling and familiar. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and its features were blurred, indistinct, as if it were trying to materialize but couldn't quite manage to do so. The team froze, the blood in their veins turning cold. "Jameson?" Jacobs whispered, though his voice was shaky, as if the name was a question he didn't want answered. The figure did not move, but its presence was undeniable, an impossible, otherworldly force that had crossed the line between the living and the dead. It was watching them, waiting for something. They were no longer in control. The entity had come. And now it was time for them to face the true horror they had unknowingly unleashed. The camp was paralyzed by fear. The shadowy figure, Jameson, or something else entirely, stood unmoving at the edge of the trees, just beyond the flickering light of their campfire. For what felt like an eternity, no one spoke. No one moved. The air was thick, suffocating, and the faint rustling of leaves was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. It was Danvers who finally broke the stillness. His voice was rough, his words coming out in a shaky whisper, but he couldn't help himself. "It's not possible. It can't be him." But it felt like him. The shape in the darkness, the way it loomed, tall and unnatural, almost intangible. This was the thing from the radio transmissions. This was what they had been hearing. And the fact that it stood there, staring at them with an unblinking, cold presence, left them all questioning the very fabric of reality itself. Jacobs, his eyes wide and filled with uncertainty, took a step back. "We don't even know if that's Jameson. Hell, I don't know if that's even human anymore." His words hung in the air like a cold breeze. There was something undeniably wrong with the figure, something that wasn't quite right, something off, too blurry, too distorted. It didn't move like a human. It didn't even feel human. There was a cold, alien quality to it, as though it didn't belong in the world they knew. Harris was the next to speak, his voice cracking as he looked to the others, his fear palpable. "But if it's not Jameson, then who or what the hell is it?" Lorna shifted uncomfortably, her mind racing as she desperately tried to rationalize the situation. "There has to be a logical explanation for all of this. There's got to be a way to make sense of it." She paused, taking a deep breath as the team gathered around her, looking to her for some sort of reassurance. Her mind spun through the options. Is it some kind of hallucination? A shared delusion? "Listen," she continued, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm no expert in the paranormal, but I've studied enough to know there are theories about this kind of thing. Maybe, just maybe, we're dealing with some kind of residual energy, or a projection of a past event. Maybe Jameson's death, his trauma, or even the mission, whatever it was they uncovered out there, it left a mark. And now it's trying to manifest, to reassert itself." The team listened in silence, considering her words. They had all been exposed to something unexplainable. The eerie voice, the flickering lights, the unshakable presence that seemed to stalk them. But was this truly something supernatural? Or was there another explanation? Could this all be an elaborate trick of the mind? A shared experience built on fear, desperation, and the looming unknown? Residual energy? Harris muttered. But how do we know that's even possible? How do we know something like that can really happen? And if it is, how do we stop it? Jacobs's voice cut through the uncertainty. Look, we've all seen enough to know that what we're dealing with here isn't just something that can be explained away. It's something we've never encountered before. I'm not saying I believe in ghosts or anything, but this doesn't feel like anything we can just chalk up to bad wiring or fatigue. The transmissions, the lights, the cold, none of it fits. It feels like we're dealing with something that's not from this world. Danvers was quiet for a moment, processing the chaos of the night, his mind desperately searching for a logical explanation. He had to cling to the rational, to the real, because without it, the alternative was too much to bear. But the figure remained there, unmoving, the darkness around it almost palpable. No one dared to look directly at it for too long, as though doing so would make it real, something that could no longer be ignored. Danvers finally spoke again, his voice more measured now. Maybe it's not Jameson. Maybe we've misread everything. Maybe it's something tied to the mission, something they stumbled onto out there. A force, a presence that wanted them to find it. That thought was more chilling than any ghost story. A force, a presence, a thing that had been waiting for them to uncover it, for them to step into a place where it could reach out and pull them in. Something that wasn't just haunting Jameson's team. It was hunting them now. Harris shook his head in disbelief. But why? What does it want with us? What's it trying to do? Lorna's expression hardened. It's like what we've seen in folklore. The idea that some things, some forces, can't be contained by death. That they live on in the spaces between the worlds, feeding off those who come too close. And if this entity, Jacob said slowly, his voice barely a whisper, was tied to Jameson's team, tied to their mission, then maybe we're just part of its cycle. Maybe it's been waiting for someone else to come along to finish what they started. The weight of that idea sank in. It was more than just a ghost, more than just an angry spirit seeking vengeance. This entity, whatever it was something ancient, tied to the earth in ways they didn't understand. It had been here before. It had touched their world, and now it had found its way into their reality. And it wasn't going to let them leave. We've got to get out of here, Danvers said suddenly, his voice sharp with urgency. We're not prepared for this. We need help. We need more people. We need equipment. We need... Before he could finish, the camp's lights flickered and dimmed, casting the entire area into deep shadow. The figure still standing at the edge of the trees seemed to grow larger, its shape more defined in the eerie half-light. It shifted slightly, its movements jerky and unnatural, and for a split second, it looked as though it might come closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared back into the trees, vanishing into the night like a wisp of smoke in the wind. No one spoke for a long time. They couldn't. They all knew the same thing, that whatever had just happened was only the beginning. Theories had been thrown out, doubt had settled in, but the most terrifying truth was now undeniable. The entity wasn't just following them, it was waiting for them to act, waiting for them to make the wrong move. And somewhere deep down, they all knew. They were trapped. The uneasy silence stretched for what felt like hours. The strange figure, the voice that echoed from the grave, the flickering lights, and the oppressive cold. They all lingered, haunting the air around them. It felt as though every moment brought them closer to something they couldn't see, something that hovered just out of reach, always watching, always waiting. But now, more than ever, the team knew one undeniable truth. They couldn't wait any longer. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. "We're not going to solve this by standing here," Danvers finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was gruff, determined. "We need to go deeper. We need to figure out what we're dealing with, and we need to find a way to stop it. It's coming for us, and if we just sit around, it's going to pick us off one by one." His words hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time in days, the team moved as one. The fear that had paralyzed them was still there, but now it was edged with something else, a sense of urgency. They could no longer deny the threat. The supernatural force, whatever it was too real to ignore. Jacobs, his face still pale from the night's events, looked at the others. "We're going back to where they found the entity. We need to see it for ourselves, figure out what they uncovered. If there's anything left there, anything that can give us an answer, we're going to find it." The team gathered their gear and made their way out of the camp, trekking through the dense, darkened forest that surrounded them. Every step they took felt heavier than the last, as if the very earth beneath their feet was pulling them down. The air had grown even colder, the shadows deeper. The night seemed to close in on them, tightening around their shoulders like a vice. They walked for hours, their flashlights cutting through the darkness in narrow beams. Each flicker of light revealed nothing but trees, twisted branches, and the ever-present hum of the night's strange silence. But no one spoke. No one asked what they were hoping to find. There was only the feeling that they were moving toward something they couldn't yet comprehend. Eventually, they reached the clearing where Jameson and his team had made their final discovery. The ground was barren here, scarred by something, though no one could say exactly what. The remains of old equipment were scattered around, broken and rusted from years of neglect. But the most striking feature of the clearing was a large, flat stone in the center, half buried beneath the dirt and leaves. The stone seemed out of place, too smooth, too deliberate, as if it had been placed there with purpose. "This is it," Lorna whispered, almost to herself. "This is where they found it." Danvers nodded grimly. "We need to get a closer look." The team circled the stone, each of them kneeling to inspect it. The air was thick with tension, every one of them acutely aware that they were trespassing on something far beyond their understanding. But there was no turning back now. They had come this far. Jacobs reached down and wiped away some of the dirt from the stone's surface. At first, it seemed like a plain rock, but as he cleared more of it away, something became visible. Symbols, strange and angular, etched deep into the surface of the stone. They were not of any language the team recognized. They looked ancient, primal, like something from a time long forgotten. "They must have found this during their mission," Jacobs muttered. "Whatever they uncovered, it must have been tied to these symbols. It's all connected." Danvers stepped forward, inspecting the markings with a growing sense of unease. "Do you think this could be what summoned it? Whatever this entity is, do you think it was tied to this stone?" Lorna studied the symbols carefully, trying to make sense of them. "I don't know. But there's something here, something we're not seeing. These symbols are almost like a map, a diagram. If we could decipher them—" Suddenly, the air shifted again. The temperature dropped even further, and the once distant lights began to flicker in the sky. This time, they weren't in the distance. They were right above them, moving erratically, darting across the darkened sky like some sort of beacon. The team looked up in horror, their hearts racing in their chests as they realized what they were seeing. It wasn't just the lights. The very air seemed to pulse with a low, resonant hum, like the sound of something unseen coming closer. "It's here," Harris whispered, his voice trembling, and then, as though summoned by their very presence, the figure appeared again. It stood in the shadows, a tall, distorted shape that flickered in and out of existence. The team froze, instinctively drawing closer together, their eyes locked on the figure, unsure whether they were seeing something real or merely a projection of their fear. But then, the figure moved. It didn't step forward, but rather, it shifted, as though it was suddenly closer, right on top of them, looming in the darkness. They could feel its presence now, tangible, suffocating. And there, within the murky depths of the shadow, a pair of eyes appeared, faint, glowing with a cold, unnatural light. They were unblinking, unfeeling, and they fixed on the team with a malevolence that sent a shiver down each of their spines. The air grew impossibly cold, the hum of the lights intensifying until it felt like their eardrums were vibrating. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, the shadows around it deepening until the space seemed to contract. Then, with a sudden jolt, the ground beneath their feet trembled. It wasn't an earthquake, it was something else, something much more unnatural, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn. Lorna gasped, stumbling back. It's coming for us! It's pulling us in!" Jacobs pulled her back, his voice sharp with urgency. "We need to go, now." The team scrambled, making their way back toward the tree line, but the closer they got to the edge of the clearing, the stronger the pull became. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something physical, a force they couldn't fight, no matter how hard they tried. And then, just as they reached the trees, the voice came again. It wasn't from the figure. It wasn't from anywhere they could see. It came from everywhere, a low, rumbling whisper that seemed to invade their minds. "You can't escape. You've already crossed the line." The trees around them began to sway, even though there was no wind. The shadows stretched longer, darker, and the world around them seemed to warp. The voice echoed again, louder this time. "This is where it ends." The ground beneath them shook once more, and they ran. They had no choice. There was no more time to think, no more time to try to understand. Whatever it was that they had uncovered, it was real, it was here, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The moment they turned and ran, panic consumed them. The ground shook beneath their feet as if the earth itself was fighting to hold them back. The woods had become a living, breathing entity, a place that no longer obeyed the laws of nature. The air was thick with the sound of the voice, that low, rumbling whisper, as if it were following them, reverberating through their very bones. Every step they took felt like they were sinking deeper into something that was pulling them in, dragging them closer to an unimaginable fate. Their breaths were ragged, hearts pounding as they scrambled through the dense forest. The trees around them bent unnaturally, their limbs twisting in ways they shouldn't, as if the very woods were warping, reacting to the entity that had been unleashed. The shadows stretched longer, darker, and the sky above seemed to shift, the stars disappearing one by one, as though something was erasing the very fabric of reality itself. Danvers led the charge, pushing his legs harder than ever before, but even he could feel the weight of the air around them, pressing down, suffocating them. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the figure, Jameson, or whatever it was, close behind them. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive darkness, the trembling earth, and the cold that had sunk into their bones. Jacobs was beside him, still holding Lorna's hand as they pushed through the underbrush. "Keep going," he shouted, his voice hoarse, adrenaline giving him the strength to keep moving. "We need to get out of this damn forest!" But no matter how fast they ran, no matter how hard they tried to escape, the trees seemed to grow, thicker, the shadows darker. The path forward became harder to find, and they stumbled over rocks, fallen branches, the very earth seeming to conspire against them. It was as if the forest itself was shifting, closing in around them, trapping them in an inescapable web. And then, without warning, the ground beneath them buckled. The air was torn apart by a deafening crack, the sound of a rift splitting the earth. It was like the world had been shattered, a deep, unnatural rumble rising from the depths of the earth. They fell, tumbling forward, and just as quickly as it had started, everything went silent. They lay there, stunned, gasping for breath, the world spinning around them. It was hard to comprehend what had just happened. One moment they had been running for their lives. And now they were still, surrounded by nothing but silence. The oppressive weight of the atmosphere had lifted, but the sense of dread was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. "Is it over?" Lorna asked, her voice barely a whisper. She turned her head slowly, eyes scanning the clearing they had landed in. But before anyone could respond, the voice came again, louder this time, more distinct. "You cannot run from what is already inside you." The voice wasn't from a radio. It wasn't from some machine. It was in their heads, in their hearts, vibrating in their very souls. It was everywhere. It was them. The earth trembled again, more violently this time as the figure appeared before them. It wasn't the same distorted shadow they had seen earlier. This time the form was clearer. Real, if anything from this nightmare could be called real. It was tall, towering above them, its body flickering in and out of focus like a glitch in a broken reality. It was not human. It had no clear shape, but instead it seemed to be an amalgamation of darkness, light, and shadow, an ever-changing form that defied all logic and comprehension. The eyes, those eyes, glowed with an unearthly light, piercing the darkness like twin stars in a void. And then it spoke, its voice a deep, guttural growl, shaking the very ground beneath them. "I am the echo of your past, the echo of your choices, the one you awakened." Danvers stumbled backward, his face a mask of horror as the figure's presence seemed to expand, filling the clearing. It was as if the very air had thickened, the weight of its malevolent power pressing down on them, suffocating them. We didn't wake you," Jacobs stammered, his voice barely audible. He was trying to hold it together, but the sheer force of the entity's presence was overwhelming. "We didn't ask for this." The figure's laugh was cold, hollow, and impossibly deep. "You don't ask for what you awaken, soldier. It is the nature of things forgotten to return. It is the nature of the cursed to seek those who will carry their burden." Lorna's hand trembled in Jacobs's grip, but she pulled away, her voice shaking but determined. "What do you want from us? What are you? What are you really?" The entity paused, as if contemplating her question. Its form flickered again, its eyes narrowing in response. "I am the consequence of choices made long before you. I am the past that never died. And now, I will claim what belongs to me." The air seemed to freeze around them, and suddenly every single one of them felt the weight of history pressing down on them. The trees, the earth, the very land beneath their feet. It all felt wrong. They were no longer in the world they knew. They had crossed into something else, something timeless and terrifying. The ground beneath them shifted again, and they were pulled closer, helpless, as the figure stepped forward, its eyes locking onto them. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The entity seemed to freeze in place, its form flickering as though it were losing its grip on reality. And that's when they heard it. A crackling sound. A voice. It was the radio again. "You must leave, now." The voice was urgent, desperate. It was Jameson's voice, but this time it was not a warning from the past. This time it was a call for help. Without thinking, without a second to analyze, Jacobs grabbed Lorna's arm. "We have to go, now!" They didn't wait. They couldn't. The voice was their only chance. and they followed it, running through the darkened forest, no longer caring about the world around them, only about escaping the grip of the entity that had almost claimed them. The entity didn't follow, not immediately, but they all knew deep down that it was still there, watching them, waiting. Its presence lingered in the air as they fled, and they could feel it, like a weight on their backs. The forest might have let them go for now, but that didn't mean they were safe. The voice had given them a chance, but how long would it last? The air was thick with tension as the team pushed forward through the forest, heartbeats pounding in their chests, feet stumbling over uneven ground. Every time they glanced over their shoulders, they half expected to see the figure looming behind them, its cold eyes burning into their backs. They didn't dare stop, didn't dare slow down. They had no choice but to keep moving, to outrun the oppressive weight of the entity that was still chasing them, still lingering in the shadows. It felt like hours before they finally reached the edge of the forest, the trees parting to reveal the open field beyond. But even as they emerged from the darkness, there was no sense of relief. The silence of the night was deafening, the absence of the usual forest sounds only heightening the unease gnawing at their minds. The air was still, the breeze non-existent, as if nature itself had gone mute in the wake of their confrontation. Lorna collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, her chest heaving with exhaustion. Jacobs dropped beside her, his hands shaking as he tried to steady himself. They had barely made it out of the woods, and yet the fear was still raw, still palpable. Danvers paced in tight circles, his eyes darting back towards the forest as though waiting for the entity to emerge from the trees. "It's not over," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse. "It's never over." "We can't keep running," Harris said, his voice strained. He was crouched beside Lorna, trying to catch his breath. His eyes were wide with panic, and there was a tremor in his hands. "It's everywhere. It's not just in the forest. It's in our heads. It's inside us." The team's faces hardened as they processed his words. Harris was right. The terror wasn't just physical. It wasn't just a shadow that lurked in the woods. It had followed them. Every step they took, every breath they drew, it was there, coiling around them like an invisible thread, binding them to the force they couldn't escape. Jacobs looked at Danvers, his expression grim. "We need to figure out what it wants. We need to stop it. If it's truly inside us, if it's part of us now, then we need to find a way to cut it out." "We don't even know what it is," Lorna said, her voice tight with frustration. "It's not just some spirit, not just some ghost. This is something older, something tied to the land, tied to the very fabric of existence. We've opened it, and now we can't close it." There was a heavy pause as everyone exchanged looks. They were all in agreement. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about understanding what they were up against. If they didn't find a way to stop it, then there would be no escape. The entity wasn't just hunting them. It was feeding on them, growing stronger with every passing second. "We need more answers," Danvers finally said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We need to go back to the stone, back to where this all began." The thought of returning to the clearing was almost unbearable, but there was no other choice. They couldn't just run, not anymore. The only way to end this was to confront it, face it head on, and try to understand what had happened to them, what had been awakened, what was now hunting them. The team gathered their strength, steeling themselves for what lay ahead. They had no idea what they were walking into, but they knew one thing. They were running out of time. The journey back to the clearing felt even longer than before. The tension in the air was unbearable. The weight of the forest seemed to press down on them as they made their way through the dense trees. The oppressive silence returned, and with it, the sense that they were being watched. The world around them felt distorted, Wrong. Every tree, every shadow, every whisper of the wind was somehow foreign, somehow hostile. As they reached the clearing, they could feel it. The presence. It was there. The stone, the symbols, everything was exactly as they had left it, but the air was thicker now. Heavier. The temperature had dropped even further, and the cold gnawed at their skin, creeping into their bones. Danvers stepped forward, his eyes scanning the area, looking for any sign of the entity. It had to be here. It had to be waiting. And then, just as they had feared, the ground beneath their feet trembled again. Not a small shake, not an aftershock. This was something else, something far more powerful. The air vibrated with an unnatural hum, and the trees began to sway, as if something was forcing them to move. It was here. The figure appeared once again, but this time, it wasn't just a shadow in the distance. This time it was in front of them, standing tall and looming in the center of the clearing. The flickering distortion of its form was stronger, more defined. It had grown somehow since their last encounter. Its presence felt like a living force, radiating power and malevolence. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its eyes, glowing with cold, unrelenting light, locked onto them. It knew they were there. It had always known. Lorna shuddered, her body trembling in fear. "What do you want from us?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The entity's form seemed to shift, the shadows around it expanding, warping, until it was no longer a figure, but a presence that filled the entire clearing. It was everywhere, suffocating them, drowning them in its power. "You have awakened me," it rumbled, the voice echoing in their minds. "You have broken the boundary. Now, you must bear the cost." The air grew colder, sharper, as if the entity were drawing the very life force from them. It wasn't just a force they could fight with weapons or logic. It was a force that lived, breathed, and consumed the very essence of what they were. Danvers stepped forward, his hand on his weapon, but it felt useless. The entity was beyond anything they had ever encountered, beyond anything they could comprehend. But then Jacobs, his face set with determination, spoke. "We don't know what you are. We don't know what you want. But we've seen enough. If you want us to bear the cost, then we're ready to make a choice. We won't just stand here and let you destroy us." The entity's eyes narrowed, as though it were studying him, weighing his words. It didn't respond immediately, but the oppressive force around them seemed to intensify, the pressure growing unbearable. "You cannot escape what you have brought forth," it hissed. "The past has already claimed you. There is no turning back." For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the weight of the entity's power pressing down on them like an invisible hand. And then, out of nowhere, the ground beneath them shattered again. The entity was ready for its final confrontation. And so were they. The ground cracked beneath them, the earth splitting open like the mouth of some vast, unseen creature. The vibration rattled their bones, the sound deafening in the unnatural stillness that had preceded it. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire forest would collapse in on them. But then, just as suddenly as the tremor began, it stopped. They stood frozen, trapped in a moment where time seemed to hold its breath. The figure, looming and flickering, hadn't moved. Its cold, glowing eyes remained locked onto them, as though it were waiting for something, waiting for them to understand, to make their move. Jacob's mind raced. The situation was hopeless. The entity was too powerful, its presence too consuming. They couldn't outrun it. They couldn't fight it. They had no idea what it truly was or what it wanted from them. But there was one thing he knew. There had to be something they had missed. Something in the past. Something tied to this cursed place that could give them the answer, the clue, the key to putting an end to it all. We've been looking in the wrong places, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice was strained, desperate. This isn't about fighting it. It's about understanding it. What did Jameson's team find? What was the last thing they discovered? Lorna's eyes widened. The last report, the one that was sealed. Jacobs turned to her, his gaze intense. Yes, the one they tried to hide. It has to be in there. Whatever Jameson's team uncovered, it might be the reason this thing is tied to them, and to us. With urgency, the team began searching their packs, scrambling to find the file, the one that had contained Jameson's final entry. They hadn't had time to study it thoroughly, but now it was clear that it held the answers they desperately needed. Lorna was the first to find it, flipping through pages that had been hastily packed. "Here," she said, holding up the report. It was a single sheet, torn at the edges, the handwriting frantic and disjointed, as though Jameson had been in the midst of a panic when he wrote it. The entity is not bound by time. It exists in all places, all moments. It has no past. It has no future. It is eternal. The symbol we found is its anchor, a gateway between worlds. We cannot close it. We cannot escape. But we can sever its connection. To do so, we must... The last few words were smudged, difficult to read, but the message was clear. Jameson's team had discovered the entity's true nature. It wasn't just a ghost or spirit. It was something far older, something that existed in all places, at all times. And it had been waiting for someone to stumble across the ancient symbols and unlock the path that led directly to it. Jacob stared at the paper, his mind racing. We can sever its connection, that's it. We have to destroy the symbol. We have to destroy its anchor, the very thing that's holding it here. The realization hit them all like a thunderclap. The stone, the symbols etched into it, were not just markings, they were a key, a gateway. "We've been focusing on the wrong thing," Danvers said slowly, as if understanding it for the first time. "The entity isn't here to kill us. It's here because we opened the door. We need to close it, and we can only do that by destroying the symbol." Lorna's eyes met his. "But if we destroy it, won't we be destroying the very thing that's keeping it contained?" "We don't have a choice," Jacobs replied, his voice hardening with determination. "If we don't destroy it, this thing will keep coming. It will keep growing stronger until we're all lost to it." Without another word, the team made their way back toward the clearing, their pace quickening as the sense of urgency gripped them. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest itself was resisting their progress, pulling at their legs, drawing them back into the heart of darkness. When they finally reached the stone, the figure was waiting. Its form flickered in the shadows, its eyes burning like cold embers. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, filling the air with an oppressive, impossible weight. They had arrived at the clearing. But they hadn't come to fight. They had come to end it. The stone, now that they were closer, seemed even more unnatural. The symbols had shifted slightly, almost as though they were alive and waiting for them. The moment they stepped closer, the air grew even colder, the shadows deeper. The entity's power pulsed with the rhythm of its symbols, as though it could feel them approaching. It knew what they were about to do. Danvers approached the stone, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch it. The cold was unbearable, seeping into his skin, biting at his fingers. But he didn't stop. With a deep breath, he traced one of the symbols with his finger, feeling the jagged edges beneath his touch. And then he saw it. For the first time, the symbols didn't seem like a collection of ancient markings. They didn't seem like a random pattern. They shifted before his eyes, warping and twisting in ways that were impossible. The stone wasn't just a barrier, it was a living thing, a binding force that connected the entity to this world. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "We need to break it. Now!" With one final, determined motion, Danvers stepped back and raised his weapon. The moment the first strike landed on the stone, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The entity's form flickered violently, its eyes blazing in rage. "Stop them!" it hissed, its voice shaking the very air. "You cannot undo what you have done." The stone cracked, the symbols twisted, and with each strike, the ground quaked more violently. The team didn't stop. They couldn't. Each blow shattered the stone a little more, until finally, with a deafening crack, the stone exploded in a burst of light. The very air seemed to crack and split with the force of it, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze in place. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The air grew still. The ground stopped shaking. The shadows lifted. The oppressive force that had pressed down on them for so long seemed to dissipate, leaving only a lingering, eerie calm. And when they turned around, the entity was gone. Its form had disappeared, leaving only the memory of its presence, like a fading nightmare. It was over. For now. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the forest was still. Too still. The air was no longer thick with the oppressive cold or the hum of the entity's power. There was no longer the weight of its presence crushing down on them. It was as if the world itself had exhaled, released the tension that had been building ever since they had first set foot in the woods. The team stood motionless in the clearing, their eyes fixed on the shattered stone. The symbols were gone, erased by the force of their destruction. Yet, despite the seeming victory, a deep, gnawing sense of unease lingered in the air, unshakable. Lorna broke the silence first. "Is it really over?" Her voice trembled with uncertainty, as though she couldn't fully believe it. It had been too much to process, too much to understand in such a short time. But the truth was there, unspoken, yet obvious. The entity was gone, and they had broken the bond that held it to this world. Or had they? "We've broken the anchor," Jacobs replied, his voice low but steady. "We've severed its connection. But that doesn't mean it's gone for good." Danvers turned to face them, his brow furrowed in thought. "What do you mean? It's gone. It has to be. We saw it disappear. It's finished." Jacobs shook his head. "The thing we encountered wasn't just a single entity. It was a part of something bigger, something that exists beyond our understanding. That stone, it was just the physical anchor. But the entity itself, it's a cycle. It exists in all times, in all places. It's always waiting for someone to awaken it. It's been here before, and it will be here again." The weight of his words settled over them like a shroud. The sense of victory they had felt when the stone shattered began to fade, replaced by the creeping realization that this battle might not have been the last. "We didn't just stop it," Jacobs continued. "We merely interrupted it. We didn't close the door. We just pushed it back." Lorna's face twisted in confusion. "You mean we're still in danger?" Jacobs nodded, his expression grim. "The entity was never fully contained. It's tied to the land, to the very fabric of the world. It's not something that can be destroyed with a single blow. What we've done is only temporary. For now it's sealed, but only for now. Eventually the cycle will repeat itself." The implication was chilling. The entity would return, and they would have no idea when or how. The curse of the land, the endless loop that Jameson's team had uncovered, was a part of something much larger than them. It was a phenomenon that stretched back through history and would, eventually, return to claim its next victims. Danvers clenched his fists. "So, we're just supposed to sit here and wait for it to come back? We can't let that happen." "We won't," Jacobs replied. "But we need to be prepared. This is something beyond us, and we need to understand it if we're ever going to stop it completely." The team stood there in the clearing, their minds racing. It was clear that the situation was far from over. But now, they had something they didn't have before. The knowledge that the entity was not just a single haunting, but a cycle. A pattern that had existed for centuries and would likely continue for centuries more, unless someone could find a way to truly destroy it once and for all. "What are we supposed to do now?" Harris asked, his voice small. "We can't just leave this place, can we? What if it comes back?" Jacob's gaze hardened. "We don't leave, not yet. We stay. We find a way to stop it for good." Lorna nodded, her face determined. "We can't let it win. Not again. Not after everything we've seen." They knew what had to be done. They couldn't walk away from this. Not when the entity could return at any moment. They needed to study the history of the land, understand what had happened in the past, and find out if there was any way to finally sever the entity's hold on this world. They couldn't allow the cycle to continue. But as they turned to leave the clearing, something caught Jacob's eye. A faint glimmer of light shone through the trees, reflecting off the ground at the edge of the clearing. He stepped forward, curiosity gnawing at him. "Wait," he said, raising a hand to stop the others. "There's something here." The team followed him, their steps hesitant but driven by the need to understand what they had missed. As they approached, they saw it, a small object partially buried beneath the dirt and leaves. It was metallic, old, and rusted, but its shape was unmistakable. It was another military dog tag. Jacobs bent down to retrieve it, his fingers trembling as he wiped away the dirt. He turned it over and read the name. Private Jameson. A cold chill ran through him as he held the dog tag. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Jameson hadn't just been a part of the team that had awakened the entity. He was the entity's key. They had been wrong. They had thought they understood Jameson's connection to the haunting. But the truth was far worse. Jameson hadn't simply been a victim. He had been the vessel. His connection to the entity wasn't just the product of a cursed land. He was the anchor, the heart of the cycle. And now they realized the truth. Jameson hadn't died. He had become the entity. The past was not just repeating itself. It had never ended. The team stood in stunned silence, the weight of this new revelation sinking in. The cycle wasn't just a phenomenon tied to the land. It was tied to Jameson's soul, to the past. And that meant that even though they had broken the stone and severed its connection to the entity, it wasn't gone. It was inside them. And there was no telling how long it would take before the cycle began again. The cold that had filled the forest only moments before seemed to intensify as Jacobs held the dog tag in his trembling hand. It wasn't just a piece of military equipment. It was the key to everything. The key to the curse, to the entity, to the cycle that had been repeating itself for generations. And the worst part? The worst part was that they had never truly stopped it. Jameson hadn't just been a victim of the haunting. He had become the haunting. His soul, his essence, had been consumed by something far older than any of them had imagined. The entity had used him, twisted him into something else, something that could cross time and space, reaching through the veil of life and death to claim others. "It's inside us now," Jacobs whispered, his voice hollow as he stared at the dog tag. The weight of his words hung in the air like a thick fog that none of them could escape. Danvers stood a few paces behind him, his face grim as he tried to process what Jacobs had just said. The implications of this new revelation hit him hard, and the reality of their situation became clearer. The entity wasn't just a force that could be fought or outrun. It wasn't something that could be destroyed by a single blow or sealed behind a stone. It was tied to them now. Lorna, who had been silent up until this point, finally spoke, her voice cracking with disbelief. "You're saying Jameson is still alive? That's what you're telling me?" "No," Jacobs replied, his voice steady but filled with regret. "Jameson is dead, but something else took his place. The entity consumed him. It used him as a vessel, as a way to reach into our world. And now it's inside us. All of us. We're all connected to it." Harris took a shaky step forward. "So, we're all marked now? Just like Jameson? We're all part of this thing?" Jacobs nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Yes. Whether we want it or not, we've become part of its cycle. It has already begun, whether we're ready or not. And it won't stop until it gets what it wants." The realization was too much to bear. They had tried so hard to escape the nightmare. They had fought and broken the anchor, thinking that would be enough. But now they knew that the entity's grip on them was far deeper, far more insidious than they had ever imagined. "We need to confront it. We need to face whatever Jameson became," Jacobs said, his voice filled with a new resolve. "We can't let this continue. We've tried running, we've tried fighting, but it's not just about breaking the cycle. We need to break the connection." They all stood in silence, knowing what had to be done. The fear, the doubt, the terror, it all loomed over them. But there was no turning back now. The entity had already taken hold. The only way to truly stop it was to sever the connection once and for all. "Where do we even begin?" Lorna asked, her voice tight. "How do we fight something like this? It's not even real. It's in our heads. It's inside of us. How do we stop something like that?" Jacobs looked around at his team, his eyes hardening. "We stop it by facing it. We confront what we've become, and we stop it before it consumes us all, before it consumes everything." Danvers stepped forward, his expression resolute. "We know what it is now. We know how it works. The cycle has to end, or else we'll all be lost." But before they could act, a sudden chill gripped the air, like a sudden shift in the atmosphere. It was unmistakable. The ground beneath their feet trembled as though the entity was awakening again, reaching out from within them. And then, in the silence that followed, a voice whispered through the darkness. "You cannot escape. You are already mine." The voice wasn't coming from any one place. It was everywhere, reverberating inside their skulls, seeping into their minds like a poison. It was inside them now, deeper than any memory, deeper than any fear. Jacobs clenched his fists. "It's not real. It's just a voice. We can't let it control us." The entity's form began to materialize once again in the clearing. It was no longer a shadowy figure, but something far worse, something that seemed to transcend the laws of nature itself. It was shifting, warping, twisting in and out of existence. Its eyes glowed with an intense, unnatural light, burning with the cold fire of the void. Its form flickered like a broken reflection in shattered glass. But its presence, its weight, was undeniable. The entity spoke again, its voice booming, as though it were everywhere and nowhere at once. "I am eternal. I have waited for you all, and now you belong to me." There was no turning back. No more running. No more hiding. The team's minds raced, but they were no longer afraid. They had faced the darkness, and now it was time to fight back, to take a stand. Jacobs stepped forward, holding the dog tag tightly in his hand, his voice steady and full of determination. "You may be eternal, but we are more than just your vessel. You don't own us." Danvers, Lorna, and Harris moved with him, their resolve hardening. They had been haunted, marked, and hunted, but now they understood the truth. The entity thrived on fear, on control, and the only way to defeat it was to take control back. "This ends now," Jacobs said, his voice louder, more certain. The energy around them seemed to pulse with the force of his words, pushing back against the oppressive darkness. The figure faltered, its form warping violently as though it were losing its grip on reality. The force of their defiance was weakening it, breaking its hold. But the entity wasn't finished. Not yet. With an ear-splitting roar, it surged forward, its form snapping into focus. It reached toward them, its shadowy hands outstretched, trying to consume them in a wave of dark energy. But just as the figure lunged forward, the team acted. Together they raised their arms toward the sky, their voices unified in a single cry. "We break your cycle!" The world seemed to crack. The earth trembled beneath their feet, the sky above darkened, and the entity screamed, a guttural, horrifying wail that echoed through time itself. In that moment, everything went silent. And then, with a final, blinding flash, the figure shattered into nothingness, its presence dissipating into the air, leaving behind nothing but the lingering remnants of its dark power. The team stood there, panting, their bodies trembling, their minds still reeling from the confrontation. They had faced it. They had faced the entity and won. For now. The clearing was quiet once again. The oppressive weight had lifted. The air was still. But deep down, they knew. The cycle wasn't truly broken. It would return. It always would. The question was no longer if it would return. The question was, who would be next? The silence that fell over the clearing was as suffocating as it was eerie. The team stood motionless, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. The entity, the thing that had tormented them, hunted them, driven them to the edge of sanity, was gone. For now, they had won. They had broken the cycle, destroyed the connection. They had faced the darkness and lived to tell the tale. But even as they breathed a collective sigh of relief, something didn't sit right. The air was still thick with the remnants of the entity's power. It was as if the world itself hadn't fully recovered from the confrontation. The ground beneath their feet still felt unstable, the very atmosphere heavy with an unshakable tension. Jacobs looked around, his heart still racing from the fight. He couldn't help but feel that something wasn't over. Not completely. The entity had been defeated, yes, but its presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. The battle had been hard won, but victory felt incomplete. "It's not over," he muttered to himself, more to reassure his own trembling thoughts than anyone else. Danvers, standing nearby, heard the words and turned his gaze toward Jacobs. His expression was unreadable. "What are you talking about?" Jacobs exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I feel like we missed something. Like there's another layer to this that we haven't uncovered yet." Lorna, who had been silently watching the rest of the team, took a cautious step toward him. "You mean like a twist? Some kind of—" "Exactly," Jacobs interrupted, his voice tight. "We've been so focused on fighting it, we've forgotten the bigger picture. The entity, Jameson. It wasn't just a ghost or an evil force. It was something that had been trapped in time, and we may have just opened the door again. Even if the cycle is broken now, it's still a part of us. We've been marked by it." Before anyone could respond, Harris, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward, his eyes wide with realization. Wait a minute. There's something I don't understand. Something about Jameson. What if he wasn't just part of the cycle?" Jacobs looked at him, confused. "What do you mean? What if Jameson was the cycle?" Harris's voice was growing more frantic as he spoke, his eyes scanning the faces of his teammates for understanding. What if the entity, what it really is, isn't a thing, but a person? Or something that can take over a person, something that feeds off the fear of others? The realization hit like a cold wave, freezing everyone in place. Jameson hadn't just been a victim. He hadn't just been the one who'd triggered the entity's presence. He had been the cycle, the vessel, the one who had kept the entity alive, kept it feeding, kept it growing. Jacob's eyes widened as he pieced it together. So, you think Jameson, after all of this, became the entity itself? Like he was the one holding it together? Harris nodded slowly. Think about it. Everything about Jameson's death was strange. What if he didn't die at all? What if, when he was killed, he just became it? What if the entity is living through him, and what we thought was his death was just a change, a transformation? Lorna's face went pale. You mean it's possible that Jameson never truly died? That he became part of the cycle? That it wasn't just something supernatural? Jacobs felt a sickening chill run down his spine. That means he's still out there. Somewhere. Danvers stepped back, shaking his head. No, that can't be right. We destroyed the stone. We severed the connection. We broke the cycle. But even as he said it, doubt began to creep into his voice. Was it possible? Was there still a chance that the entity, in some form, had survived? Or worse, had changed? Was Jameson now the entity itself? And if so, where was he? The team stood in stunned silence, processing the twisted realization. They thought they had destroyed the source. They had thought they had put an end to it. But now they weren't sure. Was it really over? Or had they merely unlocked a new, darker chapter in this cycle? Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled again, and this time it wasn't just a shake. It was a violent jolt, like the earth itself was coming apart at the seams. The team's eyes widened, their instincts kicking in as they instinctively stepped back, bracing for what was to come. But nothing happened. The tremor stopped. The air grew still again. Jacobs turned to face the others, panic rising in his chest. We've missed something. We've unleashed something else. Lorna's voice shook. We've been so focused on fighting the entity, we never asked the right questions. What if we were never meant to destroy it? What if, by fighting it, we've only ensured that it can never be finished? Harris, now visibly shaking, looked around the clearing, his mind racing. Jameson is part of the cycle. He's never truly gone. We don't know where he is, what he is now. But I think I have an idea. His voice lowered, the weight of his words sinking in. Before anyone could ask, Harris ran to the broken stone, crouching down to inspect the remnants. His fingers trembled as he brushed away the dust and debris, revealing a small, blackened relic that had been embedded deep inside the cracked stone. He held it up to the team, his face pale and filled with dread. This wasn't part of the original stone. It's new. It was placed here after we broke the connection. The cycle isn't over. It's just changed. A faint, dark glow pulsed from the relic, and the team collectively gasped as they realized what it meant. The entity wasn't defeated. It had adapted. It had evolved. And whatever Jameson had become, it was now searching for a way to return. The silence that fell over the clearing was as suffocating as it was eerie. The team stood motionless, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. The entity, the thing that had tormented them, hunted them, driven them to the edge of sanity, was gone. For now, they had won. They had broken the cycle, destroyed the connection. They had faced the darkness and lived to tell the tale. But even as they breathed a collective sigh of relief, something didn't sit right. The air was still thick with the remnants of the entity's power. It was as if the world itself hadn't fully recovered from the confrontation. The ground beneath their feet still felt unstable, the very atmosphere heavy with an unshakable tension. Jacobs looked around, his heart still racing from the fight. He couldn't help but feel that something wasn't over. Not completely. The entity had been defeated, yes, but its presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. The battle had been hard won, but victory felt incomplete. "It's not over," he muttered to himself, more to reassure his own trembling thoughts than anyone else. Danvers, standing nearby, heard the words and turned his gaze toward Jacobs. His expression was unreadable. "What are you talking about?" Jacobs exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I feel like we missed something. Like there's another layer to this that we haven't uncovered yet." Lorna, who had been silently watching the rest of the team, took a cautious step toward him. "You mean like a twist? Some kind of—" "Exactly," Jacobs interrupted, his voice tight. "We've been so focused on fighting it, we've forgotten the bigger picture. The entity, Jameson. It wasn't just a ghost or an evil force. It was something that had been trapped in time, and we may have just opened the door again. Even if the cycle is broken now, it's still a part of us. We've been marked by it." Before anyone could respond, Harris, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward, his eyes wide with realization. Wait a minute. There's something I don't understand. Something about Jameson. What if he wasn't just part of the cycle?" Jacobs looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "What if Jameson was the cycle?" Harris's voice was growing more frantic as he spoke, his eyes scanning the faces of his teammates for understanding. "What if the entity, what it really is, isn't a thing, but a person? Or something that can take over a person? Something that feeds off the fear of others?" The realization hit like a cold wave, freezing everyone in place. Jameson hadn't just been a victim. He hadn't just been the one who'd triggered the entity's presence. He had been the cycle, the vessel, the one who had kept the entity alive, kept it feeding, kept it growing. Jacobs's eyes widened as he pieced it together. "So, you think Jameson, after all of this, became the entity itself? Like he was the one holding it together?" Harris nodded slowly. "Think about it. Everything about Jameson's death was strange. What if he didn't die at all? What if, when he was killed, he just became it? What if the entity is living through him, and what we thought was his death was just a change, a transformation?" Lorna's face went pale. "You mean it's possible that Jameson never truly died? That he became part of the cycle? That it wasn't just something supernatural?" Jacobs felt a sickening chill run down his spine. "That means he's still out there, somewhere." Danvers stepped back, shaking his head. No, that can't be right. We destroyed the stone. We severed the connection. We broke the cycle." But even as he said it, doubt began to creep into his voice. Was it possible? Was there still a chance that the entity in some form had survived? Or worse, had changed? Was Jameson now the entity itself? And if so, where was he? The team stood in stunned silence, processing the twisted realization. They thought they had destroyed the source. They had thought they had put an end to it. But now they weren't sure. Was it really over? Or had they merely unlocked a new, darker chapter in this cycle? Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled again, and this time, it wasn't just a shake. It was a violent jolt, like the earth itself was coming apart at the seams. The team's eyes widened, their instincts kicking in as they instinctively stepped back, bracing for what was to come. But nothing happened. The tremor stopped. The air grew still again. Jacobs turned to face the others, panic rising in his chest. "We've missed something. We've unleashed something else." Lorna's voice shook. "We've been so focused on fighting the entity, we never asked the right questions. What if we were never meant to destroy it? What if, by fighting it, We've only ensured that it can never be finished? Harris, now visibly shaking, looked around the clearing, his mind racing. Jameson is part of the cycle. He's never truly gone. We don't know where he is, what he is now, but I think I have an idea. His voice lowered, the weight of his words sinking in. Before anyone could ask, Harris ran to the broken stone, crouching down to inspect the remnants. His fingers trembled as he brushed away the dust and debris, revealing a small blackened relic that had been embedded deep inside the cracked stone. He held it up to the team, his face pale and filled with dread. This wasn't part of the original stone. It's new. It was placed here after we broke the connection. The cycle isn't over. It's just changed. A faint, dark glow pulsed from the relic, and the team collectively gasped as they realized what it meant. The entity wasn't defeated. It had adapted. It had evolved. And whatever Jameson had become, it was now searching for a way to return.